Hello everybody, my name is Michael Freeston. I'm Director of Quality Improvement at the Early Years Alliance, and I am joined this afternoon by Melanie Pilcher, Quality and Standards Manager.
Good afternoon.
The subject of today's webinar is preparing your provision for the Education Inspection Framework, Ofsted's new inspection arrangements which come into effect in September of this year. For those of you who are seasoned webinar attendees, I'll just run through the structure of the session. For those of you who've not attended before, don't be scared. It's very similar to attending a normal seminar, but by broadcasting on the web, we're able to hit a lot more people in the same time from the comfort of your own home and with cakes. We will deliver about a 25 to 30-minute presentation. Might be slightly longer today because there's some real detail we need to go into. And at the end, we put some time aside for questions and comments. But I would encourage you to send through your questions as they come up, or any comments as well, because webinars work best as a dialogue. Part of my role today, as well as giving some of the input, is to act as the intermediary between your questions, and I generally ask them of Mel so that I don't have to answer them myself. We will look to create a webinar in due course in terms of other publications that we will have at the end. And so this will not be an isolated activity. We are providing a whole series of resources for practitioners to help them prepare for the new inspection arrangements in September. Just to show you how to make a question, you should have a little control panel down the side of your screen, and you can type straight into there. That then comes up on my screen. Nobody else sees it, so you can ask anything or make any comment you wish. And I try and find a suitable time to interrupt Mel and weave that into the conversations. It does say on the system that you can answer the question in any of those languages, German, Spanish, French and Italian. Please don't.
Please don't.
It won't help us get you a reply. Right, today's topic. The Education Inspection Framework will be introduced in September 2019, replacing the Common Inspection Framework. We've had the CIF since 2015, and what was important about the CIF was that it applied across Ofsted's educational remit, so whether it was early years, primary and secondary schools, and adult learning and skills. The same will apply with the Education Inspection Framework. And so some of the discussions we've had in the past, that some of the concepts didn't necessarily translate well into early years, you may find as we go through today's session that some of those concerns are still echoed, but we'll talk through those as we go. As well as the publication of the main document, Ofsted back in January also produced the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Statement, which again applies across all of the education sector. And most of our session today will be focused on the Early Years Inspection Handbook. You hopefully have been aware, and you submitted responses to a consultation that finished on April the 5th, I think it was, yes. Mel, thank you. And a lot of the attention, if you've been following the trade press, has been on the differences between the Early Years Inspection Handbook and the Early Years section of the Schools Inspection Handbook. There's also been conversation about the definition of cultural capital, which has been introduced to the Education Inspection Framework, and Ofsted's concept of knowledge. And you'll be pleased to know that none of that is of our focus today. What we want to look at today, and I've spotted my first typo,
I've seen it too.
Is how you will prepare your setting from now and to September for the introduction of the new early years, the new Education Inspection Framework, and also what you do when you get the call on the day that Ofsted are coming in, and how you can make sure that your provision is always Ofsted ready, as we've got there. One word of caution that goes with today's session is the consultation finished earlier this month. We are expecting Ofsted's response to the consultation, and it may well influence the final draft of the inspection handbook. So what we're working on is a draft copy, but clearly some of the major concepts and the major issues that we'll talk through today will not change. These have been central to Ofsted's aims and objectives of introducing the new inspection framework, so you can rest assured that while there may be some changes and tweaks on the detail, the thrust of what we're going to talk through today will be what you're facing in September.
Okay.
Mel.
Thank you. So, just wanted to pick out a few of the things that Ofsted have been at pains to get across to the sector as they launched the consultation and the draft framework. It's clear to us that it builds on much of the research evidence that we're all very familiar with, and we're going to look briefly at that later in the presentation. And it's evidence that has underpinned most of the previous updates as well, which really does underline the point that Ofsted say that this is an evolution and not a revolution. But unfortunately, a lot of that got skewed somewhere along the way as people searched for hidden meanings in the EYFS, and we seem to get caught up in what became a very data-driven culture, both from Ofsted and from local authorities as well. And then Ofsted have also made it clear that they will continue to produce their myth-busting blogs, and if anybody's taken the time to look at those, they are really helpful. And a round of curriculum workshops has already taken place. I'd be interested to know how many of you out there have actually attended one of the curriculum workshops. I did manage to get along to one of them, and I did find it really, really informative.
And we pitched a few of their slides for this presentation.
Oh, we did indeed. And Ofsted have also been at pains to point out that they will remove any measures that do not genuinely assess the quality of education. And again, this builds on the direction of travel in recent years, as Ofsted have moved from inspection that focused on paperwork to an approach that values what they could see happening in the setting rather than what they were reading about.
There's an interesting sentence, the last one on the slide there, prioritising weak revision and observing more outstanding practice.
Yes, we had a discussion about this, didn't we? We're not quite sure how that's going to work. Yes.
Yeah, we'll see what that means in due course.
Okay, so let's have a look at some of the key elements now of the Education Inspection Framework. A greater emphasis on curriculum. Again, we're going to talk about all these in more detail. There are still 4 judgment areas, but they are slightly different. There is a new quality of education judgment, which focuses on, and you'll hear us say this many times this afternoon, intent, implementation, impact of the provision's curriculum, and a greater emphasis throughout on vocabulary and books and that concept of cultural capital. So those are the key things that we're actually looking at this afternoon as we move through.
And just to re-emphasise, again, whilst we're talking about the draft and subject to consultation issues, you can rest assured none of those points will change. Those will be the situation that will be part of the inspection framework come September. Okay,
so if we just move on. And I have a quote here from Jill Jones, Deputy Director of Ofsted Early Education, and she says, as it is on the slide, much stays the same. Evolution, not revolution, is our mantra. The EYFS will still be the curriculum framework, and we intend to keep our definition of teaching. So a few things sort of came out of that when we first looked at it. Is the EYFS a curriculum? The term is often used to describe a planned sequence of instruction, and that doesn't really sit well with us in early years because we know that early learning is not a linear process, and that, of course, children learn and develop at different rates and in different ways. However, Ofsted are quick to point that out that the term curriculum and educational programmes, which we are indeed used to, are interchangeable.
And just to give a bit of historical context to that, yes. I remember when they were introducing EYFS back in 2008, then Minister of State Beverly Hughes was concerned about using the phrase curriculum because there was a political sensitivity to the media picking up on this notion of the nappy curriculum. So they chose to use this educational programmes, and it made no difference whatsoever. The Daily Mail revelled in the idea that there wasn't to be a nappy curriculum. So I don't think there's anything that should necessarily exercise us too much about this wordplay between curriculum and educational programmes, as long as Ofsted's interpretation of the curriculum is recognised across the broad early years foundation stage aims of learning and development.
Yes, yeah, and I think key to that is where we've previously seen the focus almost exclusively on the quality of teaching and learning in early years. We now have repeated reference to curriculum educational programmes, i.e. what is taught. So, you know, again, we're going to be looking at that a little bit more as we move through. And in order to make some of those points, we've actually pinched some of Ofsted's slides, duly referenced, of course, and the curriculum is not the same as teaching, the pedagogy. The curriculum is what is taught and how it's taught.
So we are talking there in terms of a summary of what is taught is the early years foundation stage, and how it is taught is the effective characteristics of effective learning, etc.
Yes, yes, that's the teaching, yeah. The curriculum is also not the same as providing experiences. Providing experiences is not a substitute for thinking about what children need to learn. And at the curriculum workshop that I attended, Jill Jones did make the point about having observed some very complex and complicated and absolutely wonderful activities. But when she asked the practitioners what they wanted to achieve from them, they couldn't actually tell her.
Yes.
So, you know, that they're really keen to get that point across to us. Okay, and then there's a final one that we just wanted to point out. A good curriculum is based on proactive thinking, is the product of clear consideration of the sequence of knowledge necessary for children to make progress towards the early learning goals. And it ensures all children are ready for the challenges that await them.
And I think one of the key elements there is that proactive thinking, that thinking on the part of all the practitioners and it's the team game when we're talking group-based provision, and from a childminder's perspective, their own. Why are we doing what we're doing? And also, importantly, as we go through today's sessions, what are the theoretical and research implications of why we're doing it in the first instance?
Exactly. So, you know, what is our intent and what underpins that? Thank you, Michael. Okay.
The inspection handbook is divided into various sections, and I took the dull bit. Inspection handbook part 1 looks at the formal structures, the technical aspects of how Ofsted will inspect early years provision. So it was a joy to read the EIF against the current version of the CIF to see where there are textual changes. None of today's session is a substitute for you reading the new inspection handbook, I should say that, but I wouldn't suggest that actually you do necessarily do a read across to the current CIF, because it's difficult to try and read one directly against the other, as there's been some reordering, there are changes to the headings, but there are some interesting changes of note, and I think some of these reinforce Mel's point in terms of the reinforcement of this notion of curriculum and also the why certain things are being done. There are a couple of technical points I'll draw your attention to, though. You're aware that there is the situation in terms of if a provider had 2 consecutive inspections that have been judged as inadequate and judged inadequate at a subsequent third, then they can have their registration taken away. That has been slightly strengthened so that if provision has been given 2 previous requires improvements and is likely to be judged inadequate, again, if there's no improvement at the next inspection, then they can be judged as inadequate, which I think is an important change, but let's celebrate the fact that I think Ofsted's last annual inspection, 96% of provision is currently judged as good or outstanding. So hopefully this is something that is not a major consideration for our provision.
And I do think this is about inspectors as well, making a judgment of a setting's capacity and willingness to improve.
There is also another interesting one in terms of inspections that have been prompted as a result of risk assessments. You'll be aware that the current arrangements are that it's not necessarily a bad thing if something is reported to Ofsted, because if they investigate and find that actually the setting has learned well from whatever happened and has improved the quality of provision, then that is generally considered to be a sign of a responsible provider and good leadership and management. But there is an interesting addition to that now, that actually if there are a number of notifications, particularly within a short space of time, or that relate to similar incidents, this could be an indication of wider weaknesses. So I think that's Ofsted learning from the fact that actually there may be situations where individual provision is prone to numbers of reports to Ofsted, and they need to start factoring that into their risk assessments as well. Just to reinforce a point in terms of Ofsted's direction of travel over recent years, the self-evaluation form is no longer part of the inspector's preparation for inspection, and there is absolute logic to that because I think it's for about the last 2 rounds. Yes. There has been no requirement for providers to present a formal document called a self-evaluation form. So the change in the wording of the new EIF reflects the non-requirement to produce this formal document, but, and this is a point we say with in all of our support to provision, you still have to demonstrate that you have an accurate view of the quality of provision and know what you're doing to improve. The best way to do that is to have a document, if you wish to call it a self-evaluation form or a quality improvement plan, that's up to you. But actually having something as a tangible document seems to me a no-brainer.
Absolutely, yes.
There's also a few interesting changes to the evidence collected within the sample of children tracked by the inspectors. Now, this must include the quality of support for children with SEND, and the reason why children may not receive their full entitlement to early education and the impact this has on them, particularly those from disadvantage, and also specific reference to the early years pupil premium, or if a child is subject to child protection plan or a children in need plan, at least one of those then must be included in the sample of those tracked. Now, what's interesting is that all of these elements were there in the existing common inspection framework, but I think bringing them together within the single list that's produced at paragraph 51 demonstrates the importance that inspectors will place on looking at children of interest, and also is something you will have to consider when you're preparing for inspection and thinking through which of the children present on the day might be of interest to the inspector.
And also shows how things that were in the leadership and management criteria have actually moved to part 1 of the handbook, and we'll talk about that later.
Interestingly, much of the evidence now comes in terms of must discuss with the leaders and the manager. And this reflects back to Mel's earlier comment that this is less about data being driven, but it's more about the capacity and the ability of the setting staff to articulate the why of what they're doing. So I think when we talk later on in terms of how you do your preparation, you need to be increasingly confident that every member of your staff, whether it's the new inductee or the person from the agency or your new apprentice, is able to articulate to an inspector in discussion why they are doing what they're doing. And that's an important challenge.
Exactly, yes.
The inspectors must discuss with leaders and practitioners what they intend children to learn, know and do as a result of the curriculum offer.
And that's it. When you're doing that wonderfully complex activity and that inspector asks you, what is your intention here? What is it you want to achieve?
Yeah. And they must follow this discussion through in their observations and discussions with children at play and staff interactions. So not only have you got to be able to talk the talk, you have to be able to walk the walk or play the play, I suppose is to extent. Mandy's just asked a question, and can we use an action plan as a set? By all means, Mandy. Those sorts of things are exactly, because it's what works for you in the setting to make sure that everybody is moving in the same direction to improve the quality.
And Mandy, if you'd like to look at one of the previous webinars we did when the SEF was removed, we actually do cover all of the things that you need to put in there in whatever form you decide to use.
Please visit our YouTube page and you'll find it. A couple of other points in terms of part 1. When observing interactions between staff and children, inspectors should consider how well, and there's a list again on paragraph 64, which I don't have in front of me, but two of the interesting ones, as Mel alluded to earlier, now is how well staff read aloud and tell stories to children, and sing action songs, nursery rhymes and games. Now, it's interesting that those have been added there, and I think one of the points that Mel considered coming back from the curriculum discussion was how the language that is used in stories and songs is different. Do you want to
it was one of those things when I first saw this, and I thought, well, of course we do that. But they were able to show us and made the point of how some of the things, I think it was the tiger that came to tea was the example that was used, and the language that the tiger uses as he comes to the tea table is something that a child wouldn't normally hear in everyday conversation. So just that more complex language that we actually get to use in books, in storytelling. So yes.
And the joint observations will continue, and I think what's interesting from when these were introduced back in about 2012, I think it was.
Yes, it was.
How welcome they have been seen as part of Ofsted's move towards a professional dialogue with practitioners they're inspecting. And so those will continue, but what is interesting is that the focus of them is slightly different, that now their role is to assess the quality of the implementation of the curriculum or educational programs. And I think what was interesting, why I pulled this out, was it replaces the previous reference, which was to assess the quality of providers' monitoring and evaluation of staff's practice. And so it shifts the emphasis of the inspection trying to find, the observation trying to find out if the manager knows how good his or her staff are, to actually focus on the staff themselves implementing the curriculum of the setting.
Yeah. The difference between the quality of teaching and learning that's happening and the effectiveness of the educational programme.
Just a comment from Joe. I like that there is more focus on stories and songs. I think that's an important point, Joe. One of the issues I mentioned with the introduction is, and I'll mention this only in passing without going into it in any great detail, is there is a certain suggestion that this might be a foreshadowing of the revised early learning goals that we are expecting from the DFE, which gives greater emphasis in terms of book use and storytelling in nurseries. Now, we have done a webinar on this, and again, you can find that on your YouTube site, so it's not appropriate to go into detail here. But I think you're right, that we should recognise that actually the vocabulary and the language that is used in stories and in books is different from vernacular conversational language, and therefore it does introduce children to the more complex and comprehensive vocabulary.
But also ensuring that your practitioners have a really good repertoire of stories, nursery rhymes and so on, because they don't all come out of books.
And I love the fact it's action songs rather than just singing. Okay. Mel.
Okay, so as we move on to part 2 of the inspection handbook, which is concerned with how early years provision will be judged, again we've borrowed another slide from Ofsted. So we're looking at the original early learning goals on the left-hand side there, and the, sorry, not early learning goals, the inspection judgments, I apologise, and the old ones. So you can see that teaching, learning and assessment and outcomes now becomes one judgment, new judgment, quality of education. We can see that personal development, behaviour and welfare has actually been split into 2 judgments, behaviour and attitudes, personal development, and leadership and management remains the same, but actually the content and the criteria is quite different. Now we're going to go on and look at each one of these in more detail now.
There is an interesting comment. We were having a conversation before today in terms of how these will get graded. And for those of you who read regular Ofsted reports, what has become apparent over the last probably 2 inspection cycles is how most gradings are now becoming the same, setting either scores outstanding, grade 1 across all areas, all good, etc. And you can see the logic to that because, and certainly now, if we're moving towards, I don't see how you could get an overall effectiveness grade of good or better if your leadership or if your leadership and management and your quality of education is anything other than good, and I'm sure Ofsted would agree with that. And it would seem strange if you were somehow to score less well on behaviour and attitudes and personal development, because that reflects on your leadership and management. So that whole discussion about why grade individually may come up again But I think within those areas of focus, I think it's understandable the direction of travel in which Ofsted are taking us.
Okay, so let's have a look at the first judgment then that we're going to focus on, which is quality of education. And the educational programme provides the curriculum framework, as we said, that leaders must build on to decide what they intend children to learn and develop, which is the intent. Nothing new there, as the EYFS still stands in its current form. And if the EYFS is our intent, our educational programme, our curriculum framework, and then we've got the implementation, which is looking at your curriculum delivery, the teaching, the pedagogy, the assessment, formative and summative assessment. And when I was looking at some of the research papers, I actually picked out some of the things that they've said about assessment, and I'm going to talk those through later as well. And then finally, the impact, the attainment and progress, the knowledge and skills, and children's readiness for the next stage in education. So what does that mean then? So what do we need to think about? I'm sorry about the busy slide, but I'm afraid there's a lot to think about.
Yeah, that was my fault.
Yes. So in terms of intent, I think you've got to be really clear about the activities and opportunities that are available to support children to learn and develop. And yes, that's something that you do. But for example, we talked about Ofsted being a bit concerned about some of the wonderful activities that they see that have no clear intent. So for example, if you're growing broad beans in a clear container with children, the intent being, and I've drawn from the early learning goal, it allows children to make observations of plants and talk about changes. And one of the first steps, and this again, when Ofsted talk, and I know we're not going to get hung up on their interpretation of knowledge building, but how children build on the information and the learning that they have. And as I read through, and then from what I've heard so far, intent does not require formal planning, or it certainly does not require additional planning. And this seemed to be the sense that I got from the curriculum workshops, that providers that were there were concerned that what they were hearing was actually going to generate more paperwork for their practitioners. And that is absolutely not the case. Ofsted do not want to see evidence of your intent through what you have written down and planned. They want to see it in what you're actually doing and what you're talking about with them.
And I think this is an area where the new EIF is strong for early years. If you're in a school, if you're doing secondary school education, for example, it's all too easy for the geography teacher to say the intention is to get them through the GCSEs or to get them through the A-level, and my role is to secure that. What we always talk about in early years is, well, and it's an overarching principle of EYFS, every child is unique. And therefore, what you're able to do is consider what is the intention of the activity for this individual child, and what is that child going to get from it. So it allows us to be able to demonstrate to the inspector that we know our children, we know their needs, and we know that why child A will be particularly motivated by an activity, and what we expect that to be as the next stage of their planning and development, as taking them on to the next stage. So I think this is a real strength of the new inspection focus for the early years practitioners.
Definitely. And then we come on to implementation. And again, we've said this in previous webinars, I know, but it's even more important now, a shared understanding of what teaching looks like in your setting. The definition that Ofsted gave a few years back of what they meant by teaching still stands, it's still there. So Ofsted say they will be having a focus on how well staff watch, listen and respond to children. Again, how well staff are reading aloud and telling stories, how well staff support children to recognise and respond to their own physical needs, and how well staff enable children to explore and solve problems as one of the key characteristics of effective learning, and how they support children to express their thoughts and use new words. And then I put here about formative assessment and how that's used to shape your response to individual children. And formative assessment doesn't, again, we do these little notes, these little stick-its, don't we, that of things that we've observed, and we call this our formative assessment. But actually, this is also about how you respond at the time to what you're seeing a child doing, and how you give feedback to that child, and how you support them to scaffold their learning. That's part of what your formative assessment is as well, so it's not all written down. And then finally, we're looking at impact, the summative assessment that is not overly burdensome and gives a clear indication of the gains that children are making in their learning. And in terms of Ofsted and of impact, we revisit Ofsted's Teaching and Play in the Early Years, a Balancing Act, which was published in 2015. This has also contributed to the Education Inspection Framework and does remain relevant.
Just a question. Mandy has said, I'm asking on behalf of members in my session, will they be able to get a copy of the slides? Yes, we can make those available to you, Mandy. That's no problem.
They will be on the YouTube channel. Oh, you want a copy of the slides?
Well, we'd sent them across to. Yep, that's fine. That's no problem at all. Just one other point, just on the. Sorry, talked across you then, Melanie. The final point there, I think, is of using. Yes. And again, if I was Ofsted's design guru, I would probably redesign the 3 intent, implementation, impact, not in a hierarchy, but in a cycle, because, and particularly from an early years perspective, because it is exactly that learning that takes place whenever an adult is interacting with the child to actually assess where their learning is, that actually then informs the intention for the continuation of that activity or what will be the next activity. So it's more of a cycle in an early years perspective.
That takes them towards that
the next
goal.
Bit of intention.
Yeah, definitely.
Because the intention is fluid in response to the implementation and impact previously. Thank you.
Okay, so if we move on now to behaviour and attitudes, these are demonstrated through the characteristics of effective learning, which are now referred to, thankfully, explicitly within the Education Inspection Framework, and previously there was no reference to them at all in the framework. So I'm really pleased to see that. And then how well providers promote attendance, particularly for children eligible for EYPP, and of course attendance is not mandatory in early years. However, good attendance helps children to form good habits for future learning. Of course, this presents a challenge for providers who in some instances will have to manage this carefully so that it doesn't feel heavy-handed. And then, as we move on to look at the grade descriptors, it's easy to see how the inspector's observations will inform their judgment, because this is where providers need to be clear about how they respond to children's behaviour and be able to demonstrate to the inspector that they understand how some children's additional needs can translate into challenging behaviour. Again, this is about practitioners knowing and understanding the children they're caring for, and most importantly, being able to convey their knowledge of the child to the inspector. Yeah. And in doing so, we're less likely to see a poor judgment about how behaviour is being managed that's based on a single incident that an inspector might have observed out of context. And we do hear about this happening quite a lot.
Yeah. Just one comment on the attendance issue. This refers back to the fact that the EIF is the framework for all of Ofsted's education remit. So clearly, in compulsory school-age children, attendance is a key element. So I think it's slightly nuanced. It still has to apply in the early years, but as Melanie explained, it is the issue of the potential impact of sporadic attendance on a child's learning and development, rather than it being something which is of concern from a regulatory perspective.
And definitely, I think where children are in receipt of EYPP, you know, it's about breaking down those barriers to attendance as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. I've lost my slide. Did I get it?
No, we're there. We're there. Personal development being the third of the 4 judgments that we're looking at. And the grade descriptors for personal development focus on input, so how your provision actually promotes personal development. And this includes, amongst other things, how your educational programme or curriculum supports confidence, resilience, risk and challenge, life in modern Britain, and British values, which again get a first mention explicitly in the framework. And we now see in personal development some areas that were currently grounded in physical development early learning goal, for example, health and self-care, diet and exercise. So in terms of what we're thinking about, the thing that struck me very much with this, with the input, this is very much about the role of the key person and how vital that is to supporting parents, to supporting the child, to actually supporting all of and putting that input or getting that input across.
And just to comment on that, there was some debate during the consultation period about what's the benefit of separating out behaviour and attitudes and personal development, particularly from an early years perspective, when children are developing in the round. And I suppose the way I've looked at it is the behaviour and attitudes focuses on the child themselves in terms of how they interact with children, how they interact with their peers, with their important adults and the activities. And the personal development is what are the structures that are put in place by the setting or by the childminder to support that child's development. So I'm not sure if that's a particularly helpful distinction, but that's certainly the way I've looked at it. What will be interesting is whether there are any different grades for those two areas.
That will be interesting, actually, and it's something that we'll certainly be looking at as the new inspection framework comes in and we start to see inspection reports going live. Yes, I just wanted to say a quick word about risk and challenge as well, because this is something that Ofsted have recently expressed concerns about, that we are actually suppressing children's innate need to experience risk and challenge. So again, from my perspective, certainly that's a really welcome addition.
True. It is true.
Okay. And then
moving on.
Finally, and these aren't in particular order, so perhaps it's wrong to say finally, because it all begins and ends with leadership and management, doesn't it? The inspection activities that are in part 1 of the handbook now form part of the evaluation for leadership and management. As I mentioned earlier, some of those things that you mentioned that are now in part 1 of the handbook were previously in the evidence required for leadership and management. Some of what was previously specified has been absorbed into the other judgments, and leadership and management also, interestingly and very, very relevant at the moment, refers specifically to workload issues and the well-being of staff, and how managers and leaders in a setting will actually recognise that and manage it. And we've also got the culture of safeguarding being referred to, rather than just the safeguarding processes, but that idea of a culture of safeguarding that runs through the setting and has an impact on everything that you're doing. And so some of the considerations for that then, if we just move on. So you're going to really need to think about here how staff are supported to manage their workload. So reducing the burden of unnecessary paperwork, in particular planning and observations. I don't know, Michael, you might want to say a little bit more about that with our current involvement. Yeah. We'll come back to that in a moment. How do you actually support staff well-being as well, and being able to show actively how you're doing that? And then, of course, being clear about how you're going to communicate the focus on intent, implementation and impact, whilst ensuring that staff do not feel the need to produce more paperwork.
Yes, it's one of the things that Ofsted has in its sights across all of the education provision is, and you could say that this was partly of their own making in former times, was a concern about the amount of data that schools particularly feel as though they need to produce to demonstrate that students are making endless progress. I'm always reflecting back on that reference, the analogy that actually doesn't matter how many times you measure a pig, the pig won't get any bigger. But where they're doing assessments every half term and tracking that data, there is a concern on the part of Ofsted that actually there is an industry of data generation, and that is not what they're interested in. What they're interested in is that notion of articulate practitioners, teachers, being able to say, this is what we are doing and why we are doing it, and this is what we expect to happen. So it is I think it's a welcome change, that actually it's a recognition of the professionalism of the staff that inspectors will be meeting, and the challenge is set to us to be able to respond positively to that very professional view.
And how much better than having reams of very complex and complicated planning and documents pinned up on the wall, which don't appear to translate at all to what is actually happening in the setting.
Just a comment on Melanie said in terms of the unnecessary paperwork. We're currently working with DFE and Ofsted to give consideration to how we can reduce perceptions of requirements from Ofsted. There is a frustration on the part of Ofsted that actually settings always say, you tell us you need to produce this, and Ofsted, no, we don't. So there is a concern that actually misunderstandings about what are required. Now, hopefully what you've seen from today's session is there has been no formal requirement for anything documentary to be produced in preparation for your inspection. Now, I think good documentation is a demonstration of strong administration, management, etc., and is a good safety net that allows you to be able to demonstrate that you're underpinned by good policies, procedures and practice. But actually, greater amount of time will be spent by the inspector talking with your staff, and that's the thing that you will need to focus your preparation on.
And interestingly, more and more settings are moving away, moving towards paper-free planning, which is probably a subject for another day, but it's really interesting to see the way we're going. Okay, so we talked earlier about the increased emphasis on vocabulary in books, and Ofsted say that a clear emphasis during inspection on the importance of vocabulary in books mirrors the proposed, well, they didn't say this, but this is what I, sorry to misquote there, but Ofsted do say knowing more words makes you smarter, and the language used in books is more linguistically complex than ordinary conversation. Reading stories, sharing rhymes and songs increases children's vocabulary.
There's a whole new workshop, a whole new webinar
definitely.
In terms of the epistemological approach of knowing more words makes you smarter.
Definitely.
We'll pick that up in another session.
Thank you for that. I shall put it in my diary. The importance of shared reading means that adults use more complex language when talking to children as they read to them. And it makes sense when you actually unpick it and look at what you're saying. You can see how very true that is. And shared reading helps to scaffold the child's language by making links, emphasising words and explaining concepts. It encourages good reading habits and positive attitudes, and it provides quality time with one-to-one attention, emotional bonding and enjoyment. So I don't think any of us would argue, and as we saw earlier with one of the comments, that story time and reading and songs and so on is really, really welcomed in any setting.
Just a short comment on the introduction of the new concept into the inspection framework of cultural capital. The statement is, inspectors will evaluate how well leaders ensure that the curriculum they use or create enhances the experiences and opportunities available to children, particularly the most disadvantaged. They say that Ofsted's definition of cultural capital matches that found in the aims of the national curriculum, but actually, if you go and look at the national curriculum, it doesn't give, it's not actually referenced within the national curriculum. So we have, in our response to the consultation, we did say that Ofsted will need to work with the sector to actually give explanations and clarifications about what they mean. My point here is, if you're doing the EYFS well, building on children's knowledge and experience and interests, you are probably meeting an effective explanation of cultural capital.
Can I just quote from Helen Moylett very briefly here? Just whilst we're all trying to figure this out, it's important to hold on to the principles in the EYFS that state that every child is a competent learner from birth.
Exactly. If for anybody who's done their first year of sociology, cultural capital was first coined by Pierre Bourdieu, post-structuralist philosopher in the French Marxist tradition, and it's all about power relations in terms of the experiences with which children, the circles within which they work, and how the networks in which they operate. So there's an entire new webinar in terms of what we mean by cultural capital, but don't panic. I think is the phrase for practitioners at this stage. If you are building on children's experiences and extending those further, based on their interests and based on how their circumstances in the home, so good relationship, good partnership with their parents to get a good understanding of that child at home, you will be able to demonstrate that your curriculum has an effective cultural capital bedrock. We will do subsequent work on that, and as I say, we have asked Ofsted to work with us to give further clarification of the expectations their inspectors will have. But do feel reassured that if you're back to the point that we said earlier on from Jill Jones, if you're doing EYFS well, you have nothing to be concerned about from the new EIF. Final on the documents, Melanie, yes. Can you take us through, please?
Yeah, we mentioned earlier that the Education Inspection Framework has been underpinned by a lot of research and does have a couple of accompanying documents, one of which is the research paper, and the other one is the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Statement. And I've just pulled out a few of the key things there. Ofsted certainly raised concerns that the curriculum, currently the body of knowledge that we intend to pass on to the next generation, has come second to performance measures and preparation for tests. And I think they're talking particularly about certainly school-based provision there, but obviously this filters down to early years. In many cases, this means that too many learners, too often the disadvantaged and those with special educational needs, are not given access to a broad, rich and deep curriculum. This can result in unlawful discrimination, which is contrary to the Equality Act. And then in the second bullet, Ofsted say that the current system leads to schools placing pressure on parents to remove low-attaining pupils from the school. And certainly in early years, our concern has been for some time now that nurseries are deterred from taking children with special educational needs, thereby depriving them of the same opportunities to education that are available to others. And unfortunately, the better settings are the ones that are more likely to feel under pressure to take those children with additional needs. And, you know, we've talked many times before about the need to be able to meet those needs adequately from the outset, and so needing to know what those needs are. And I think if we just move on, I think that's all we want to say on the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Statement, but if we just move on now to look at the overview of the research, which I did find really fascinating. This is the evidence base that underpins the 4 key judgments and gives an insight into what the new inspection focus is. It does refer primarily to some very important pieces of research that have been with us for a while now, namely EPI, so effective pedagogy in early years, and of course EPI, effective provision of preschool education.
Are those available on the Ofsted website?
The accompanying documents are, yes.
Right, the research information is there, is it?
It's there. It's one of the accompanying documents that goes along with the new Education Inspection Framework. So if you Google that, if you go onto the gov.uk website, it's there listed right next to the...
I'll just make a comment on that. And as Melanie said, we're talking there about some, I was going to say old, as in terms of established and well-resourced. So I think that's a reflection, again, of the fact that there is nothing necessarily new or radical in the EIF. It is built on what is accepted good academic research, and the consideration that we have now to do is to make sure that that fits closely with our provision of the early years foundation stage and being able to demonstrate we're doing that well.
And I think we can be reassured by the fact that the research paper does give us an insight into Ofsted's thinking, but it doesn't offer us as professionals much new insight into early years, really. I did notice in this relatively short paper the word effective crops up 106 times, in fact. But actually a really important word, isn't it? Because this is about causing a result. This effective means causing a result, especially the desired or intended result, and it becomes a very significant adjective for the new quality of education judgment. So I just felt that was worth saying.
Thank you. What next?
What next? Okay, so we are busy here updating all our existing resources to take into account the key elements of the new handbook. This includes the recording of today's webinar, which will be available on our YouTube site. Also, our very popular Managing Your Ofsted Inspection Educare module will be updated shortly. And then we are planning a new publication, getting to grips with the Education Inspection Framework and the usual round of training, workshops and consultancy that we offer. But of course, we also want to hear from you what you think you need, what you want, and how are you preparing and how can we support that further?
Great, and I think that leads it to a natural conclusion in terms of us throwing it open to our participants. I'm conscious that that was a fairly heavy 45, 50 minutes.
I was
there.
losing the ability to speak.
I hope everybody is still with us, but I do hope you found that valuable and useful, because it is, whilst we reiterated throughout that we're talking evolution, that's not necessarily to say that it's not different. And so you need to be prepared for what is coming in September. Bridget, how do people let you know what they want or need? Thank you, Bridget. The question, you will have signed on an email when you've signed on to this webinar, and so any comments and questions that you may have will be received. We receive those centrally, but also obviously if anybody wants to contact our membership and information lines either by telephone or by email, then they're more than welcome to, or leave comment on our website, because it is us sitting here thinking what we think you need, but obviously that's far better informed if you're telling us the same way. Alex, I'm reading this straight away, so I haven't read this, so I hope it goes well. It was really useful. It would be so helpful to have some mini guides that we can share with staff on curriculum and cultural capital. No sooner said than done, Alexa. We'll put that onto the list. Laura, first time on a webinar. For me, this was fantastic and very informative. Laura, you can come back anytime you want.
So please go and visit the YouTube channel as well then.
And I should have the next one on, because we're back to speech and language in May, aren't we?
Yes.
And we should know between us what it is.
I'm quite sure it's the 15th of May.
And it will be on the home learning environment, if I'm not very much mistaken.
Indeed.
Thank you. Is that a Lewisham here? Either Val's just saying they're here, or she's going to write something else. Susan Hagan, do you think that cultural capital is the same as British values? It is no.
Absolutely not. And we will go into that into more detail.
And one of the interesting things I've had conversations with in the past, which just purely happened, was a setting that was taking the entire toddler group, so it was about 10 children, to the local Chinese restaurant on the day that the inspectors arrived. And so there were some fantastic photographs of all the children sitting around with their chopsticks, etc. And there was that consideration of it allowed knowledge and experience of the world. There were those children who'd never been to a restaurant before. There was the social and emotional development. So it's those wider concepts of activities and experiences that we provide to children. They do use the phrase that they want children to understand the wow of the world. And so I think if you take cultural capital as being how can we ensure and support children's wonder and wowness at the world, you'll be doing all right. Oh, we've got some big questions coming in.
Yes.
So I'm losing track of people here. I'm waffling on too long. Hang on. Here we go. My first webinar experience really helpful. Thank you. When will the new Inspect framework come out? Val, that's a good question. We have it on good authority. It will be in good time for September. We were having this conversation. We have an expectation of June, July.
Yes.
But they haven't given us an exact date, because they will also have to publish their response to the consultation. And we hope there will be tweaks in light of the feedback that was brought. So we haven't got an exact date, but in good time for preparation is what they've said.
I'll jump in with Alison. So the next one I think was Alison, who's saying, can we have a guide for committees? That's really sensible, and yes, we will certainly look at that.
Janet, can we continue to do the planning for 2- and 3-year-olds together? Questions from a member in the West Midlands.
Yeah, there's no reason why not. Just keep in mind your intent, your implementation.
Yeah. They are not looking to determine how you do it. They are interested in your explanation of why you do it the way you do it. And if you can justify that, they're not there to tell you how otherwise. Louise, some learners don't have equal opportunity to high quality education. How does that fit when settings charge extra and children cannot access free childcare especially for disadvantaged families?
Wow.
I think, Louise, you hit on one of the major challenges about the whole concept of cultural capital.
Yeah.
If you take it back to Bourdieu's original view, he always referenced it in terms of power, and that and underpinning his concern was actually everybody's experiences should be nice and middle class values. Every child has cultural capital.
Yes.
It's the cultural baggage and experiences that they bring with them. Those can be bad as well as good. And the role of the early years practitioner is to ensure that actually the effective provision and the curriculum meets that child's needs regardless of what circumstances and cultural legacy they are bringing with them. So I think your question is absolutely right, that it would be a challenge if cultural capital were just dumped into the inspection framework without a wider recognition of the context in which children live their lives. And that will be something where we want to work with Ofsted to make sure that it is a positive development for the EIF, not something which is negative and problematic.
Can I just take the next one as well? I see Zoe says that there are some YouTube videos on cultural capital that can help with the basics, and yes, there are indeed, but in watching some of them I actually found myself more confused because they didn't relate to the early years context, so I would say use with caution.
One thing I would draw attention to that Melanie mentioned earlier on was the blog that was done.
Helen Moylett's
blog. It's
yes.
available on the early education website, and it's an excellent read. I would recommend it to everybody. Laura, I need to think carefully about how I feed this back to staff in manageable chunks for them. Yes, I think you're quite right, Laura.
Yes.
Not the way we've done it to you. We'll certainly check out your YouTube channel. That's very kind of you. Will local workshops be available? Yes, we are looking to make available a template framework which allows people to present locally. But again, I think picking up on Laura's point, there are a lot of this is we can support managers and practitioners, but a lot of this is self-reflection and consideration as to what story do we need to tell the inspector about our provision. It's not what Michael thinks or what Melanie thinks, it's how are we confident in what we know we are doing.
And I think the existing workshop that we have on managing your Ofsted inspection will actually morph into managing your education inspection.
Susan asks, when will this start to eke into inspections? I like the way you phrased that, Susan. It will straight away on the 1st of September.
Yes.
However, let's not forget that in every new iteration of the inspection framework, Ofsted have always said that they will take into account for those early inspections in the first term, first quarter, first 6 months, that actually settings will be familiarising themselves with the new inspection framework. So whilst it comes in absolutely on the 1st of September, there will be a recognition that any setting that is inspected on that day will be taken into consideration that they'll be coming to terms with it as well. But if you're doing EYFS well,
exactly,
you're doing it well in August, you're doing it well in September, it should not be an issue.
You're not going to need that much leeway.
No. Do you have to be a member of the Alliance to access the YouTube channel? No, as it currently stands. Louise, really interested in the cultural capital aspect for EAL families and children, especially as EAL has not been mentioned as a vulnerable group, and how that fits with their equality guidelines. Again, an excellent point, Louise, and I think there is more work to be done in terms of supporting the sector to understand the huge implications of consideration of cultural capital in an inspection framework. I'll say no more. Next one is from Laura again. Do you know if there's anything about outstanding settings being Ofsteded more regularly? I think it's worrying that outstanding settings are sometimes not re-seen in some cases for 7 years.
No, not to my knowledge. The priority will be on the weaker settings.
And I think that in terms of that certainly reflects the situation they have with schools, and your concern is well placed, I think, Laura. And we all know that outstanding can change very quickly.
Yes.
But again, I think the circumstances are such that there will be no change in that situation. From Val, if you have already purchased recent handbook from the Alliance, we will need to buy the new one.
No, we will do as we've always done with alerting you to any updates and making sure that you can access them online.
Will this new framework be in inspections immediately, Hayley? 1st of September
Yes.
is the first date. So if you get inspected up until then, you'll be inspected against the Common Inspection Framework,
Yes.
1st of September from the EIF. Alexa, thank you. This has made me feel more confident, and I feel the changes could be a positive move. I didn't know you had a YouTube. Oh,
We've got it all.
There's loads on there, Alexa. You'll have a great time. Thank you, Louise. Thank you to everybody. I will just waffle inanely for the next 2 or 3 seconds if anybody is still typing. In the meantime, I will thank Melanie for her hard work in putting together most of today's settings. I just helped a bit. And also to those of you who've organised group entertainments, hopefully the biscuits were enjoyable. And actually we've now set you off with loads of important discussions that will continue once we have ended the broadcast.
We had no biscuits, Michael.
No, we had no biscuits. It's just my pleasure to say thank you all for there's a few more questions coming. Thank you so much, webinar, and all your other questions. Yes, the slides, Judith, we will send them around to those who were registered. It's Michael Freeston signing off, and we look forward to seeing you at future webinars. Thank you very much.